Good evening, everyone. Please be seated. Larry George is professor of political science at California State University, Long Beach. His lecture tonight is his first at St. John's, but Larry's connection with the college is long-standing through his years of friendship and correspondence with our colleague and teacher, Robert Sachs. A little over a year ago, Robert declared, "We've got to get Larry to come here and lecture." And happily, that has now come to pass. So please join me in welcoming Professor Larry George, whose talk is titled Democracy, Empire, and the Pharmakon in Thucydides.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Howard. I'm just going to take a drink here. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. Can everyone hear me okay in the back? Okay, good. And especially want to thank Howard Fisher and Guillermo Bleitmar, who organized the talk and invited me, and to Veronica Tucker, who in the Dean's office, for handling the logistics and for her patience with my scatterbrainness over the last month or so. Sorry. And my, of course, my New Mexican friends and family members, who some of whom drove a long way to attend tonight. It's a particular pleasure to be giving a Friday lecture, since it was at one of these almost probably 40 years ago that I met my dear friend, the late St. John's tutor, Mr. Sachs, whose seemingly bottomless learning and erudition and his fertile imagination housed in a frequently miraculous, if not always cooperative body, as any of you who knew Bob. I was blessed to have shared many hours of unforgettable conversation, including those on which this lecture is based, with Mr. Sachs during those intervening years until his passing last year at the age of 94. Okay. I'm also happy to be here because it gives me a chance to wear this tie and tell a joke that almost no one ever gets, but you will. So on this tie, this is from the British Museum. On this tie is a bunch of pictures of some Greek battle, and people always ask me, "What's on there?" Some Greek battle. So what battle is it? I say, well, it doesn't say, but I know it's not the Battle of Syracuse, because no one would have ever thought of that as a tie. So, I knew that you would get it. And so you can imagine how rare that is to, even though it's not a very funny joke, it's the fact that anyone gets it at all is very reassuring. It's always a little unsettling giving a talk to people who are smarter than I am and know more. Many of you know more about the topic than I do. Reminds me of one of the endless anecdotes about the great Columbia University philosophy professor, and I'd say matchless kibitzer, Sidney Morgenbesser. Any ring a bell to anyone in the room? Some of those of us from the 20th century will remember the legends about Sidney Morgenbesser. Here's one. The story is that at some point a famous linguist came to Columbia. I think it might have been Noam Chomsky, it could have been Austin, someone, and was giving a talk about what languages all have in common, and said that, for example, we know of many languages, in fact most languages, in which a double negative can make a positive. He is not unintelligent. But we know of no language in which a double positive makes a negative. And between the pause at the end of that sentence and the beginning of the next sentence, Sidney Morgenbesser stood up and said, yeah. So this is the kind of thing that speakers dread happening when you're talking to, as I say, people who are more familiar probably with the topic of your talk than you are, but I hope that you'll be patient with me and indulge me a little bit in some flights of fancy tonight that we can share together. The invitation to the talk tonight that I'm giving asks the visiting speaker to, quote, take the audience to what you find most interesting, compelling, or unsolvable about your own work. The faculty and students are less interested in background and contextualization than in finding out what the lecturer thinks of as the beating heart of whatever it is that you're examining. And so with our joint pursuit of the unsolvable in mind tonight, I'd like to begin by introducing you to some Greek words that are at the center of my own current thinking about Thucydides, and then an interpretation that I'm going to propose tonight for the first time in public as sort of an offering, and we'll see what you think of it. As you'll recall from his History of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides' great fear is of the dissolution, whether brought about by a plague, as in Athens, or by civil war, stasis, as in Corcyra 4 years later, of the breakdown of language and the distinctions embodied in words. This collapse of language represents for Thucydides the loss of the homonoia, or the common mindset and beliefs and understandings that a healthy city rests on, and which are codified in the customs, norms, and laws, the nomoi, that regulate relations among its people, and the vocabulary in which crucial binary distinctions that hold the community together are communicated and lost with their dissolution. Distinctions, for example, as Thucydides lists them, between courage and reckless audacity, between prudence and cowardice, between moderation and disengagement, between obedience to the law and crime, between public interest and private exploitation. And then the religiously grounded distinctions between suppliants and sacrificial victims, between the holy and the profane, the sacred and the sacrilegious. And finally, distinctions between things like justice and vengeance, enemies and fathers, and peace and war. And yet, however important distinctions like these are, we also know that in Greek, as in our language, there are many words that challenge these kinds of binary distinctions, and which, in doing so, shed light on the Greeks' understandings of how many things in the world actually have double and often opposite meanings and implications and effects on human beings and our political communities. One of these ambiguous or bivalent Janus-faced words is empire, arche, or alternatively hegemonia, especially in Thucydides' continually alternating positive and negative references to the Athenian Empire, which was indeed something that brought multiple and contradictory meanings, implications, and effects for the cities of Athens and the rest of the Greek world. Thucydides is quite explicit in linking the various maladies he sees as plaguing the Greeks, not just the breakdown of language and homonoia, but the horrific violence, the increasing lawlessness and injustice and disregard for justice, the extreme economic inequality leading to vicious hatred between the classes, the dissolution of customs and rules governing relations among Greek cities, what in Greek are called the takoina nomina, the customs and rules of what we would call international relations today. He links all these to the effects of Athens' imperialism on formerly peaceful and prosperous cities and their commonwealths. Thucydides is keenly aware that empire is a two-edged sword whose effects on a polis, whether it's a peripheral island or a small town, or the imperial capital itself, can be deeply ambiguous and contradictory, salutary and fatal at the same time. Empire can both enhance a city's security, power, wealth, and unity, but it can also, and at the same time, bankrupt the polis, debilitate it, and expose it to new and often more formidable and lethal dangers to its safety and security, both from within and without. Empire acts like a kind of powerful but dangerous magic potion, what we would today think of perhaps as a sort of addictive, performance-enhancing drug. Imperialism can enhance a city's power and prosperity and stimulate euphoric feelings of supremacy, but it can also sicken, intoxicate, and even kill a polis. Greeks were perhaps better able than we are to understand these kinds of binary opposing meanings and effects of words and realities like empire, their internally contradictory duality, because Greek mythology and philosophy, in part, had long embraced the metaphysical principle of the transcendent identity of opposites, if you will. Think, for example, of the idea that the opposite of every great truth is a great truth, or Heraclitus' philosophy based on the unity of opposites, or ancient Egyptian or Eastern philosophy, yin and yang, the wisdom books of the Bible, like Ecclesiastes, or for those of you who are from the 20th century, the bird song, Turn, Turn, Turn. All examples of this. It would not surprise Greeks that Athens' empire worked like a powerful drug that was also toxic to the polis, since, in fact, the Greek word for medicine or drug or remedy or cure or performance-enhancing drug or magic potion is exactly the same word as the word for poison or toxin. This Greek word that means both cure and poison, and so much more, is pharmakon. Let me, let's see. Oops. There we go. Oops. Okay, well. So there we go. So pharmakon is the word at the top of the title there, but I skipped a slide here, so I'll come back to it. And it's one of the most interesting words in any language. First, pharmakon, the word, is what we call a polysemic word. It's a word that has multiple meanings, like the English word set, which carries scores of different meanings. Just look it up in the dictionary, several pages of meanings of the word set. Or the word tie that I used when I told that dumb joke earlier, playing on the way that the word can mean both a draw in a game and one of these things here. But the word pharmakon not only has polysemy going for it, but it is a weirder kind of polysemy. It's what we call a contronym. That is to say, a word that means the opposite of itself, and that's unusual. Greek actually has quite a few of these. English, not so many. We Anglophones tend to be more precise and to think more rigidly and in binary opposites about most things than the Greeks did. In doing so, we may actually sacrifice some of the wisdom and poetry that they thought in terms of that our language disenables us from doing. But even in English, you can get some feel for what a contronym is like. If you think about words like the word to cleave, which can mean both to come together and to pull apart, or the word sanction, which each of which have two opposite, almost exactly opposite meanings. I want for all of us tonight to try to get our heads around the way that polysemic words and contronyms like pharmakon cannot help but mean all the things that they do, so that they carry all of those meanings around with them, and that a writer or speaker can only partly control the slipping around of those meanings. Indeed, one of the things that makes clever writers like Thucydides, and of course Shakespeare, the master of English polysemy, clever. Oh, thank you. Someone from the 21st century, I think. Let's see. Shakespeare, the master of English polysemy, what makes him clever is their ability to creatively exploit these multiple meanings and connotations of words. It's also what makes jokes and puns and word plays possible, if not necessarily very funny. Puns, for example, which are notoriously considered the lowest form of humor, are examples of this. The Greek word, let's see. Okay, here we go. That's right. This is, oops. This is the, these are the phrases that the Athenian ambassadors who speak before the Spartans at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War when they're invited to come on stage and ask and plead their case. The words that they use include the word deus, this word here, which means fear. It is a, I'm sorry, please bear with me a second here. It is, the word deus, the word danon here, is like the word pharmakon, it's a polysemic contronym. It has, as Heidegger says, the strange ambiguity with which Greek logoi can cut across contending separations. If you have a little German, Greek words have what Heidegger calls auseinandersetzungen, if you have a little German to work from. Denon means, and can't help but mean all of these things at the same time. I'm sorry, my slides got out of order here. Okay. Okay. So what I'm trying to draw your attention to here is how the Greek word deus in this passage signals a kind of fear that is important to the Athenians when they were trying to explain why their empire was necessary, how they ended up being forced to acquire the empire that they did. But I've messed the slides a bit, so I'm going to have to come back to that if you'll bear with me. My apologies here. Let me continue with where I left off a moment ago, talking about the fear here that the word conveys. Okay. Think of empire as like a pharmakon, something that has two sides to it. It inescapably strengthens and vitalizes while intoxicating and poisoning cities all at the same time. Pharmakon is a relatively common Greek word, but one that Thucydides uses exactly twice. One time he uses the word is when he describes what the Spartans were rumored to have done when they threw into Athens fresh water wells, something that caused the great plague to break out there, but not in Lacedaemonia, at home where they were from. This kind of biological warfare wasn't unknown in the ancient world. And so that in this conspiracy theory about the plague in Athens, the conspiracy theory spread on the basis of what Thucydides calls a pharmakon. Again, only one of two times that he uses the word in the entire book. In this case, an ambiguous substance. You know, you drink the imperceptibly poisoned water, which is good for you, but then from the undetectable and magical sorcery of the pharmakon, you get the plague, which is bad for you, of course, unless you survive. And if you do, then the plague is also a pharmakon. You can die from it, so it's a toxin, but if you survive it, then you're immune to it. You now have a magic power, and you're even healthier than everyone around you in that sense. As Nietzsche says 2,000 years later, what doesn't kill me, as anyone in the room can finish that, makes me stronger, right? Arnold Schwarzenegger quoting him in Conan the Barbarian. What didn't kill Thucydides, who almost died from the plague, made him stronger, a stronger historian at least, considering the strength and accuracy and literary power of his account of the plague, based on his own and his city's experience suffering from it. And such are the often uncomfortable, unsettling, provocative truths disclosed by the pharmakon. The other time Thucydides uses the word pharmakon is even more interesting in some ways. The following appears in Thucydides' so-called excursus on Themistocles, where he poignantly and describes the tragic, humiliating, and Thucydides alludes, unjust and undeserved, miserable end of the life of Themistocles, the great Athenian strategist in general and politician who conceived of the naval battle plan that defeated the Persians but also revolutionized Athenian democracy, and yet was ostracized, was cast out of his home city, doomed to spend the rest of his life in exile, eventually surviving by advising a Persian king on how to wage successful war against Athens, his own home city. Okay, good. This passage here, in that appears at 138, line 4 of the Peloponnesian War. Nocesis de taliuta ton bion legosidetines kai hekusin pharmako apothanin auton adunaton nomisanta inai epitelesai basile ha hupesketo. We'll come back to this, but I do want to note immediately the way that the word pharmako appears here in this word. It is in the dative form, and it's in this form, the same form that's common to two different Greek words, the pharmakon, which you've already met, as both medicine and poison, and the pharmakos, which is a very significant word for our purposes. It means a scapegoat, or a specific kind of scapegoat, as I'll explain in a moment. So again, just to be clear, the reference form in this usage in Thucydides, one of the two times he uses the word pharmakon or pharmako here, can mean either pharmakon or pharmakos, or both. And it's ambiguous and indeterminate. Although by the state of case and by its context, the most obvious surface exoteric meaning would seem to mean pharmakon, that Themistocles died by taking a poison. But we'll see that that's only one possible reading of this later on. Since Thucydides isn't around to ask, the choice of whether he intended the reader to understand pharmakon or pharmakos or both must be read into the text. And we'll circle around and come back to this at the end of the talk. Even before we delve into these intertwined meanings of these two related but different polysemic words, pharmakon and pharmakos, we might pause for a moment and consider what scapegoating might have to do with poison and medicine, with sickness and health, whether of an individual human body or a body politic, and for our purposes, with the simultaneous vitality and sickness that empire brings to democracy. As the symptoms of imperial sickness, for example, indifference to injustice, the dissolution of distinctions, impiety, civil strife, stasis, even plague, as these accumulate, polities, especially democratic regimes, intoxicated by empire, will eventually begin seeking around for some kind of remedy for the malady they find themselves plagued by. When Greek cities looked for such remedies, they often found them in modified forms of ancient curative purification rituals, some of which dated back to the Bronze Age or before. Historically, Greek cities had developed a number of ritual ceremonies intended to cure the city of the effects of the daimonic, that is, the effects of omens, oracles, or curses imposed by the gods for hubris or sacrilege, including what we would today think of as natural disasters like earthquakes or fires or even human-caused calamities like defeat in war. Greeks were still practicing many of these purification rituals down to the time of the rise of the Athenian Empire and the Peloponnesian War. One of the aspects of Thucydides' thought that I wanted to focus on tonight is how he drew on analogies between the medical maladies that were being studied by a group of early physicians, the Hippocratic medical writers that we know strongly influenced him in his account of the war, and the supposed cures for the political disorders that Greek cities were experiencing under the Athenian Empire, and the possibility that built into his account are warnings about the problems and dangers associated with these supposed remedies, these political remedies. Specifically, I wanted to draw our attention to one type of such cure that was very widely, indeed almost universally practiced in Ionian Greek cities, including Athens, and which took several forms. This was the practice of ritualized scapegoating, known as the pharmakos ceremony. Pharmacotic scapegoating was a pharmakos ceremony, involved the selection or identification by a group or a community of another group or individual that they can convince themselves is the source of their community's problems, of its internal factional or partisan or interpersonal conflicts, disagreements, unavenged wrongs, and other possible sources of disunity, internecine conflicts, and stasis, and project these outward, away from the community itself. This displacement and projection psychologically transferred the evils that threatened the community onto the scapegoated victims, the pharmakos, and then expunged that evil from the city by humiliating, punishing, and killing or casting out the scapegoat victim, along with the toxic evil that it was presumed to bear. The scapegoat or pharmakos served as a kind of poison container, the literal embodiment or incarnation of the evils that were afflicting the community, in which they seek to cure themselves of through the killing or expulsion of that group or individual. Stop if this starts to sound familiar. Once expelled, the pharmakoi were described as a katharma, that is, that which is thrown away in cleansing, off-scourings, the refuse of a sacrifice, purifications, and the pharmakos ceremony was thus explicitly understood as a catharsis, which you're probably familiar with from Aristotle. 5th century Greeks engaged in all kinds of group and individual scapegoating, including not only the revival by Themistocles' political opponents of the earlier practice of ostracism, but the Athenian practice of executing defeated generals, as well as the pharmakos rite itself. Leo Strauss points out that Thucydides carefully recounts the singling out for unjust or arbitrary punishment of almost all of the leaders that Thucydides praises as the finest leaders of his time. You'll find that many of the great thinkers on your reading list here at St. John's will refer directly or indirectly to scapegoating, if not exactly using that term. Off the top of my head, Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and Augustine and all the modern political theorists from Machiavelli to Nietzsche and Freud come to mind. Maimonides alludes to the centrality of the Levitical Azazel scapegoat ritual, where the sins of the people are thrown over a cliff during Yom Kippur. The Torah and the history books and the books of the prophets are all replete with incidents of group and individual scapegoating. In fact, the English word that we use for the phenomenon is, unfortunately, just a bad translation from Tyndale and the editors of the King James Bible of the Levitical reference to the goat sent to Azazel with the sins of the people on it. And of course, the central message of the entire Christian New Testament centers on the divine intervention into human history through one specific, unique, divine act of scapegoating, the Passion of Christ, which is related exactly like a pharmakos ritual. It's possible that Paul of Tarsus may have actually personally seen, or at least heard about, a pharmakos rite in the years that he was traveling around the Aegean, Greek part of the Aegean. Since the unprecedented horrors of the middle of the last century, the phenomenon of scapegoating has been given a great deal of attention as political and social scientists and philosophers desperately sought to understand and explain how the regime that's widely regarded as the worst in human history came to power and unleashed its horrors, justifying its genocidal prosecutions on the basis of an ideology built around the explicit scapegoating of one particular group, the Jews of Central Europe. Yet even if scapegoating is better understood today, we need not look far from home to find examples of it around the world in 2025, including, I'm afraid, here in our own country. Nor is the temptation to engage in scapegoating at all remotely limited by ideology, creed, or party. And I originally wrote up a couple of pages demonstrating that across the ideological spectrum, but I'm not going to devolve into a political conversation at this time anyway. The pharmakoi themselves were typically chosen from the margins of society: cast-offs, slaves, beggars, the poor, and in some cases, the pharmakoi were even selected from among foreign populations or other outsiders. Occasionally, sacrificial victims were taken from among the elite, someone who had committed a sacrilege or a blasphemy that endangered the city's good relations with the gods. Although more typically, other forms of scapegoating that are structurally parallel to the pharmakos were employed. Ostracism of potential tyrants, of course, or the execution of defeated generals that Thucydides describes. The parallels in contrast with the sacrifice of innocent young women in Greek historical literature, think of Iphigenia, Aglaras, Polycrites, or the daughters of Erechtheus, among many others, to appease or curry favor with the gods in order to win their blessings for military operations and wars, is worth noting. Because of the magically restorative effects that the redirecting of group hatred against the pharmakos has on the scapegoating group, the word pharmakos also later came to refer to anything having to do with magic, to a magician or a sorcerer. This is the primary way that the word is actually used in the Koine Greek of the New Testament, for example. And remember that Jesus is not only a scapegoat, but performs what non-Christians would call sorcery himself. And even a physician who prescribes potions and medicines would also have been called a pharmakos, that cure by purging and cleansing the body. I've heard Aesop, Moses' brother Aaron, Joan of Arc, Job, Socrates, Alcibiades, Jesus, of course, and countless fictional characters in Western literature, from Caliban to Billy Budd to Katniss Everdeen, all described as pharmakoi. The etymological link between the pharmakon and the pharmakos ceremony underscores how the ritual was at the same time both medicinal and toxic to the polis. It functioned the way that the bite of the fiery serpent of Moses did, or the rust from Chiron's spear that that Achilles uses to heal the wound caused by that spear. That is, analogously to a vaccine or to a homeopathic microdose of the more general toxic social injustice and polarizing violence that it inoculates the city against. By committing violence against the innocent, you, in a sense, immunize your city against the larger violence that it perpetrates on itself and its enemies. The ritual expulsion of the pharmakos was in fact described by contemporaries as, quote, the medicine that heals the city, and which could obtain a, quote, therapeia, a service, healing, or medical treatment to relieve the city's derangement. In Athens, the pharmakos ceremony served as a sort of carnivalistic parody, mirroring the more familiar and overtly political ostracism ritual. It re-legitimated the hegemony of the city's more familiar and overtly, the city's dominant families, tribes, and ethnoi, and symbolically reclaimed and reinscribed its territorial boundaries. It reconsecrated the sacred ties between the body politic and its gods. Eventually, the ritual was formally institutionalized in the ceremonial structure of the annual Thargelia festival, while still being conducted sporadically during times of looming disaster or social or political derangement, such as droughts or famine or imminent military defeat or a plague. As Jan Brimmer, the leading living scholar of rituals of religious human sacrifice, summarizes it, quote, the scapegoats, the pharmakoi, were expelled from the city on the 6th of the month Thargelian, the first day of the two-day festival of the Thargelia. It's rather surprising to note that on the same day that the scapegoats were expelled, the Greeks also celebrated the fall of Troy, the victories at Marathon and Plataea, and even the victory of Alexander the Great over Darius. Evidently, the expulsion of evil was felt so intensely that this seemed to be the appropriate day to celebrate these victories, unquote. Socrates was born during the Thargelia and was executed by what Plato calls a pharmakon, the hemlock that simultaneously killed his body and freed his soul. The pharmakoi thus came to be expelled as part of a ceremonial complex, one of whose purposes was to secure Athens' empire and protect the city against foreign invasions and to ensure victory in war. As a result, scapegoating easily becomes addictive for states, and particularly empires. They become dependent on its temporarily politically salutary effects to resolve otherwise deremptive and destructive domestic factional conflicts and repair internal divisions while invigorating and energizing the polity. Scapegoating both intoxicates and poisons political life and the body politic, eventually reversing its initially invigorating effects. This reversal is the inescapable double effect of scapegoating, inasmuch as the scapegoated victims are always also projections that represent and embody temporarily repressed or weakened or othered parts of the community itself. Like a narcotic or performance-enhancing drug, the inescapable duality of the medicine-poison logic of the pharmakon meant that over time, the cumulative effects of the pharmakos could become malignant for the body politic. Such violence might temporarily restabilize and restore the body politic, but the superficial political homonoia sustained through scapegoating was always insecure, evanescent, and volatile, eventually requiring further scapegoating sacrifices to which empires like Athens became habituated. Let's go back to the passage that I opened tonight's talk with, or tried to open tonight's talk with, where Thucydides is discussing Themistocles' humiliating death in exile, and the dative word pharmako stands out alone in the way that enables us to imagine that it could mean either pharmakon or pharmakos. So, as I mentioned, so the word pharmako, as you can see, the top line, the top word there, is the dative form of both the words pharmakon and pharmakos. In other words, the reference to the reference, whatever it is that the word pharmako is supposed to be, pharmakon or pharmakos, has to be read into the text. Now, one possible translation of this passage is something like, but falling sick, talking about Themistocles, falling sick, he ended his life, or suffering from some malady that ended his life. Some say he died voluntarily by poison. because he thought himself unable to perform what he had promised to the king. He's sold himself out to the enemy king and has promised to help him prepare to fight a war to conquer his own people, the Athenians. Or a possible, if somewhat maybe pushy or possibly stretched rendering of this, of the hint that Thucydides may be giving us of a possible double connotation might be something like, but being sick in his soul perhaps, soul sick, he ended his life. Some say he died volunteering as a pharmakos. That's a possible translation of the phrase, unable to perform what he had promised to the king. In the Q&A, we can go back over this, and if anyone wants to parse it more carefully. I'd like to suggest that Thucydides may have been hinting here at what Themistocles, that Themistocles was himself a kind of scapegoat, a pharmakos. And that, like almost all of the other leaders that Thucydides reserves the highest praise for in his book, Pericles, Themistocles, Hermocrates, Brasidas, Pisistratus, Achilles, and Antiphon, and even the two whom Strauss says Thucydides praises in silence, Demosthenes and Diodotus, almost all of whom fit what we in Los Angeles, where I live, would call the character development arc of a pharmakos. Themistocles was demonized, scourged, cast out of the city, and sacrificed, not for the long-term good of the city, but to appease the demos. A demos in Athens that by this point was intoxicated with and by empire, was caught up in immediate feelings of disorientation, fear, and anger in a way that was easily manipulated by Themistocles' political enemies to the detriment of the city. I'd like to propose that Thucydides saw Themistocles' fate as a scapegoat as a heuristic example of the invidious effects of all forms of projection, demonization, and scapegoating by whatever group or faction or party is able to momentarily get the demos to focus their fears and anger onto some group or individual and act out their emotional disorder and confusion and purge or cleanse the community of the danger they believe is posed by them by ritually expelling or killing them, thereby purifying the polis of its sins and iniquities. I'd like to suggest that Thucydides may perhaps have been using the contrast between the virtuous public lives of the leaders he praises most highly and the mistreatment that they suffered to criticize or call into question the wisdom of this and all kinds of scapegoating practices. Not by mounting a comprehensive theoretical critique of it, that will come later with the philosophers that you are also fortunate to be able to be reading here at St. John's, but instead by inserting, perhaps smuggling or sewing clues to his own views into the text or the fabric of his narrative. After all, a text is a fabric. Pericles is perhaps the most obvious example of this because Thucydides sees him as the exemplary central tragic protagonist of the tragedy of the Peloponnesian War. Of the Peloponnesian War. Pericles' person and his career both followed the classic character arc of the pharmakos. And there are numerous references about him that use elements of the pharmakos ritual to make this point in Thucydides and in Plutarch and elsewhere in Greek literature, that once you've seen them listed out, it's hard to ignore. Let me just throw out a few. Plutarch is quite clear on this, for example, when he writes that Pericles was like a physician who treats a complicated and chronic illness, sometimes with harmless placebos, but sometimes with bitter medicine that brings them salvation. Sort of like John F. Kennedy Jr. before his tragic plane crash, Pericles was born into the highest Athenian nobility and was the kind of leader who was born to lead his polis. But by the third decade of the war, the Athenian citizenry had polarized into two mutually antagonistic parties, a peace party and a war party, and held together only by their joint commitment to the outcomes of votes in the ecclesia, in the assembly, but who disagreed about every aspect of the city's politics and who demonized and scapegoated one another with escalating ferocity. Again, stop if this starts to sound familiar. Pericles was the leader of the war party, and Athens was following his strategy of sacrificing the farms of Attica to the marauding Spartan armies and retreating into the city's walls while using Athens' superior navy to raid Peloponnesian cities. Right at the beginning of the war, it's the Spartans demanding as an excuse for war their indictment of Pericles for being the bearer of a divine pollution due to one of his ancestors' blasphemies and sacrileges, that is, that is listed as the primary cause of war by the Spartans. And this is followed immediately by the Themistocles excursus, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, in which the passage that we looked at earlier, talking about the death of Themistocles, appears, further drawing the explicit parallel with Pericles as a pharmacotic sacrifice. Plutarch compares Pericles to a Hippocratic pharmakon prescribing physician. Pericles' enemies ridiculed his brilliant Ionian lover, confidant, and possibly speechwriter, Aspasia, by comparing her to an Ionian courtesan named Tharhelia, who was what spies call today perhaps a honey trap. And this was the accusation that was made against her, using her charms to bring Greek men over to the Persian cause during that war. Recall that the pharmakos ceremony was conducted during the Athenian calendrical festival of the Tharhelia, celebrated on the birthday of the twins Apollo and Artemis, who, as you know, have something to do with human sacrifices. Aristophanes comically even blamed her, Aspasia, for the Peloponnesian War. Pericles' enemies sought to bring charges against him, Aspasia, and his teacher, Anaxagoras, and his friend, the sculptor Phidias, who appear in this drawing that you can see on the slide there, for impiety. First, in a trumped-up scandal involving the gold on his friend Phidias' colossal statue of Athena in the cella of the Parthenon, an incident that Thucydides obliquely refers to, and for blasphemously having himself depicted on the shield of the Athena statue, an act of such hubris that it was guaranteed to offend Athena and endanger Athens, if it were true. As I've noted, plagues were very likely to bring out the scapegoating pharmacotic instincts of the Athenians, and the great plague that killed, again, one of the two times that Thucydides uses the word pharmakon, that killed a third of the city's population was blamed, somewhat justifiably, I have to say in retrospect, on the war strategy of Pericles, which had brought the entire population of Attica to move into the crowded, festering city. The plague had a crushing and demoralizing effect on the city, but it was the religious associations of the plague with divine wrath among the ordinary Athenian citizens that triggered their pharmacotic scapegoating attack against Pericles. Plagues were often seen as a divine retribution for a city's failure to purge itself of pollution, like blasphemers or those who have failed properly to heed the oracles of the gods. And like Thucydides, Pericles and his circle of friends were at most, agnostics about the gods. And indeed, Thucydides never mentions the gods in his entire history as actors or agents. In fact, almost ignores them entirely in the book. And that's also true of Pericles in his speeches, in which the gods are only mentioned twice, as far as I know. And again, then not as actors or agents, but as objects. Right before the outbreak of the plague, however, an oracle was recalled, which had warned that a plague would come accompanied by a Dorian war. And this was used as part of the propaganda that was used to scapegoat Pericles for the war. Because Pericles, who was the leading proponent of the war with Dorian Sparta, and who had hung around with religious agnostics and skeptics like Aspasia and Anaxagoras, and whose war strategy demonstrably contributed to the plague's virulence and now to the resulting military weakness of the empire, became an obvious target that made it possible for the war faction and the peace faction, called the apragmones, the lovers of tranquility, if you will, to come together and convince the city's demos to depose Pericles and convict him of embezzlement. He died the next year of the effects of the plague, still in disgrace, with much of the pious demos, Pharmakos' scapegoat. Alcibiades is another. Alcibiades, here's seen in conversation with his teacher Socrates, is another obvious candidate for a Pharmakos. Thucydides' account of Alcibiades' fate is an even clearer illustration of Thucydides' imminent critique of demonization, projection, and scapegoating by imperial democracies. This has in fact been the topic of much commentary over the centuries, although not precisely in this sense. Don't have time to read it right now, but if you have a chance and you read the description of the indictment and arrest of, or attempted arrest of Alcibiades in Book 6, chapters 60 and 61 of the Peloponnesian War, you'll see very clearly how the ritual of the Pharmakos is being redescribed to account for the treatment of Alcibiades there. Aristophanes said of Alcibiades that Athens loved him and hated him, but could not thrive without him. And yet they sentenced him to death. Alcibiades was indeed both a pharmakon and a pharmakos. Stephen Pressfield, in his fine novel, The Tides of War, which I recommend, which is about Alcibiades and the Peloponnesian War, actually has Alcibiades, at one point rally his doomed troops by saying, quote, "Victory is the best pharmakon," and leaving the word pharmakon in the original Greek. After racking my brain for months after I read this, I finally tracked down Pressfield, who actually lives near me, and asked him where you found this quote. I thought I'd read everything about Alcibiades. And he confessed to me that he made it up, which is, of course, a novelist's prerogative, but that his exploitation of the double meaning of pharmakon and the point about the ambiguity of victory were both intentional on Pressfield's part. Pretty smart for a novelist, not to diminish novelists at all. Conclusion, so to summarize and open the floor for questions and comments, what I'm modestly suggesting tonight is that perhaps in this strange little vignette, this kind of mysteriously interpolated so-called excursus on Themistocles, as that section about him is commonly known, it's often seen as introduced after the fact by some later editors. Seems to me that that's putting the cart before the horse, that this little excursus on Themistocles may be one of the most revealing parts of the entire book. Because in it we can perhaps find, if we read carefully, and with an open nous, a subtler and more cryptic, perhaps esoteric, but at the same time unmistakably striking once you've noticed it, comment by the founder of Western political, diplomatic, and military history on one of the perennial, and in the absence of some messianic miracle, by now perhaps sadly inescapable feature of the entire Western political tradition down to our own time, that is, the addictive and toxic use of the diversionary scapegoating of designated enemies of the people as a futile and dangerously counterproductive remedy for what ails us, masquerading as a cure or final solution to the chronic, perennial, and perhaps inescapable dilemmas, aporias, and optimistically, perhaps at the same time, yet undiscovered possibilities of our increasingly fragile democratic political life. So let me close by thanking all of you for coming tonight and for your patience and kind attention to what I'm sure no doubt has been a bit of an arcane distraction from the many manifold temptations and pleasures offered by your campus and by this wonderful city on an evening like this. Thank you very much.